Hello, and help me welcome Ray Chadwick, Chairman of
Granite State
Taxpayers.
Hi, Carl.
Very
How are you doing?
good to see you
Hey, well,
again.
thanks for having me down here. It's
Well,
always a pleasure chatting with you.
It's always informative chatting with you.
Well, hopefully today will be no different.
Well,
We'll
I
see
hope
how
so.
that
Your
works.
subject is our voting laws.
Yeah, I'm going to talk a bit about
I think
election
people
law.
want to know that because it's such a controversial session, and it shouldn't be.
It's an amazingly hot topic,
Right.
which, when you think about it, a lot of protests going on various sides. But what I'm going to try and do is for our viewers today, sort of go through the history of why our laws are what they are, what are some of the changes that were made in the last legislature, why they make sense, and talk a bit about the ramifications if they don't change. And you mentioned I'm chairman of Granite State Taxpayers,
Right.
and Granite State Taxpayers, I put in a plug there, but that's the taxpayer organization founded by Mel Thompson, the great governor who once said low taxes are the result of low spending. So it's the oldest statewide taxpayer group. It would be 30 years in existence next March. And so people wonder, well, how come you guys are involved in this election law stuff? How does that become a taxpayer issue? And we got into this actually in 2012 because we reached the conclusion that part of what we want, we advocate for frugal government that's efficient and lives within its constitutional responsibilities. And because when it's all done, the taxpayers are the ones supporting that.
Right.
And the way the Republican system, small r Republican, the way our U.S. government and our government here is, every several years we elect representatives, they go off and make laws. And then we live under the laws. That's the deal. They make them, we elect them, they make them, we live under them. And if we don't like the laws they make, we have the chance to vote them out. And that's how you keep control over the system. And we think that is diminished anytime you allow people to vote for the representatives without actually having to live under the laws that they make. Now, 240 years ago, the big deal around here was taxation without representation.
Right.
In the system we have in this state, we have representation without taxation. So what we're looking for is changes to the voter laws that will make them simple and easy to understand. You don't have to be a lawyer. Resistant to fraud, and available only to residents of the state of New Hampshire. What are our problems with the current system? Well, the current system, people can register to vote, they can vote, without proving they are citizens of the country in the first place. Secondly, we actually, by statute, allow residents of other states to vote in New Hampshire, and that is basically quite explicit in the case of students. There's an actual RSA, Revised Statutes Annotated, basically a state statute, 654.1, that gives voting domicile to students of higher institutions of higher learning in the state. So all of that has given rise to what we see as two classes of citizens here. You got the class of citizens who are residents of New Hampshire. They vote. And
They pay taxes.
They pay taxes, they get their driver's licenses, they register their cars, et cetera, et cetera. And another class of students by law, and as a matter of fact, pretty much anyone else by law, who don't have to do all those things, but they can still vote. So part of what I want to talk about today is the history of how that all developed. And I'll give you the example, and we've been in this because we think that whole system, which by the way is unique to this state, no other state, nor the District of Columbia, allows residents of other states to vote. Not Massachusetts, not Maine, not Vermont, not anywhere. So we're unique in this, and as a consequence, we wind up with people who begin to know this, they will say something like, well, voter fraud. There's always these claims of voter fraud.
Especially when they come in by buses.
Well, exactly. And what happens each time, and I'll give you some examples. We've got data that showed in 2012, we did a LexisNexis search. You know, you're familiar with that, where you go online and look people's names up. We had some data showing that close to 100,000 people who voted, if you went into their profiles, you would find they had a primary residence out of state.
Right.
500 of them were dead. And you can move on, and I'll talk about 2016, because in 2016 we have data from the Secretary of State on these matters. So the question that really comes down to it, is this constitutional? Well, voting is a right. People will always say voting is a right, unarguable. But it is a right, indeed a franchise, that's exercisable in certain times and places. So it's exercisable in basically where you reside, the place. There's a variety of legislation and litigation on this, but think of it as the place that you hold yourself out as a public person. You know, the place where you go to the town meetings, the place where you go. If you go to the, for example, in Maryland, if you want to go to the section on student voters, they say, hey, you can vote here if you're a resident. And you're a resident if, for example, this is the place where you file your income tax returns. Show me the address on your income tax returns. You're a resident there. In 2016, the Secretary of State has this data. It was available. They coughed it out in response to a right to know request from NPR, and we got it, of course. 6,540 people came to the polls on Election Day in 2016, registered to vote for the first time, and voted using an out-of-state driver's license for identification. Now, in this state and every other state, getting a driver's license requires you to prove you are a resident. And, sort of simple things. Show me your lease. Show me a utility bill, with your name and the address you're trying to register. A variety of things. Every state's like this, including this state. However, this is a case where people would come into the polls and say, I'm Ray Chadwick and I want to vote. Okay, Ray, show me some ID. Yes, here's my Massachusetts driver's license. Wait a minute, that proves you're a resident of Massachusetts. But under our laws, you can vote. Now, some people will say, oh, those just people who moved into the state. They just didn't have time to get a driver's license. A couple of comments there. 491 of these people used a driver's license when they came in and registered from one town in New Hampshire to another town in New Hampshire. 150 of them or so actually put themselves back onto the voter rolls after they've been purged for some level of inactivity. So when you look at all of this, this is what leads to people claim, well, voter fraud. And that's not, something that just arose with President Trump. He's been most vocal about it, and he's vocal about anything he doesn't like. So he's made that sort of a big deal. But when you think about this, in that 6,500 people that I mentioned, see if I remember, 2,246 of them were from Massachusetts. Massachusetts is a state with 3 Democrats for every Republican. So there was 2,200 and some people voting. Probably 1,500 of them were Democrats. And the U.S. Senate race, Kelly Ayotte, the incumbent, lost by 1,018 votes. So part of the question here is, well, why has this been allowed to happen all these years? I should point out that when people comment, oh, there's voter fraud, I usually tell them, well, no, there's not. Everything you think is fraudulent is legal here. It's legal for you to vote if you're a student from Washington State. It's legal for you to change your registration from one town in New Hampshire to another using an out-of-state driver's license, proving you're a resident there. So we think that has to change because this should reflect the will of the residents of New Hampshire. As I mentioned earlier, we elect our representatives, they make laws. If they vote for a ration of taxes, like the current legislature just tried to and got vetoed, then we get a chance to vote them out. But if people from other states are voting them in and going home and not have to worry about it. In the town of Durham, where UNH is, they have, and I don't remember the exact numbers, but their last census showed 13,000 voting age people. It's 2010 census, so it's probably way out of date. When UNH is in session, there are about 14,000 students. Half of them are from out of state. So when you look at that and say, how is that affecting the voting rights of the people of Durham? So our approach is very simple. Make our laws like the ones in every other state in the District of Columbia. Require people to be residents. Now, I should point out that it may take you a little time to get a New Hampshire driver's license proving you're a resident. Federal law allows you 60 days after you move to vote absentee in the place you came from. Why is that, you may ask? That's because 47 states in the District of Columbia have a durational residency requirement. They require you to be a resident for a period of time before you're allowed to register or vote. 27 of the states, it's 30 days. So that's why you may not have time to qualify in your new state, you can still vote. So nobody is being disenfranchised here.
Right, I think that's what people try to pick on, that they're claiming that they're, even if they only vote for the senior positions, they probably could vote for all the representatives, as you're saying, that are establishing our laws.
Exactly.
And they don't have any idea who these are, or somebody has told them how to vote.
Well, that's the issue. And there's been litigation on this in the U.S. Supreme Court. There was a case in 1972, Dunn versus Bloomstein. The Supreme Court basically opined that it was the right of the states to establish that a person is a bona fide resident of the relevant political jurisdiction. Basically, saying the state has a right to make sure you're a resident. Now that case was about the duration of time they had to prove it. And the Supreme Court said 30 days is reasonable. Okay. Now we have same-day registration. That's a little more complicated, but I'm still sticking with the state has the right. So this is pretty much what was taken on by the last legislature when Governor Sununu was elected the first time. One of his objectives, and that of the then Senate President Chuck Morse and Sean Jasper, the then House Speaker, was to, quote, clean up this loophole. Why should we be the only state? And there are some reasons why we are, and I'll comment on them in a bit. So basically, that legislature went out and passed two bills. One was called Senate Bill 3, that actually, for the first time, required you to provide proof that you lived here. Now, this is not remarkable in other states. In Massachusetts, you go to their voter page on the Secretary of State's website, and it basically says, if you don't bring your proof into the polls, we'll give you a provisional ballot, and we'll put it here in the penalty box. And if you don't bring your proof back by the end of the day,
throw it out.
Gone. So for the first time, they established a responsibility for the registrant to provide the proof. Nobody was prevented from voting. You had 10 days after you voted to bring the proof, but there was a penalty if you didn't. We were behind this. For the first time, people had to show that they were qualified to vote. There was a second bill, House Bill 1264, and this cleaned up the loophole allowing this out-of-state voting. And I won't get into the details of it because I'm not a lawyer, and even if I was, I'd be confused. But there are some conflicts between the concepts of resident and domiciliary, and this is true in other states too, but they harmonize them. And in our case, our Constitution says you can vote if you're your domicile is in New Hampshire and you are an inhabitant. And through a bunch of years and a bunch of court cases, that got turned into the ability for someone to say, I want to register to vote and vote. Oh, do you live here? Well, no, but this is where I want to be. So it was solely on the registrant, their intent. What this also meant is if a year later, they hadn't moved into town like they said they would, there's no way to prove that it was malicious or I just couldn't find a job. House Bill 1264 made residency and domicile identical for voter law, ended this loophole. That was passed. Immediately lawsuits sprung up against both of these bills, lawsuits that were initiated by the New Hampshire Democrat Party and various supporters, League of Women Voters or ACLU, depending on which one there are. So what has now happened in the case of the most interesting one, the resident one, the governor actually sent it to the Supreme Court and said, is this constitutional? And the Supreme Court, New Hampshire Supreme Court now, they said it's unarguably constitutional that you clean up this dual classes of voters, and it's an obligation of the state to do so. So since the Supreme Court in New Hampshire has already called that a good thing, the Democrats are suing in federal court, basically to kill them. They have the Democrats that took over the legislature, they passed 2 bills to basically reverse all these changes. Both of them were vetoed, the vetoes were upheld. So the current situation now, the case in the court, state court, regarding the provide proof you live here, that has an injunction against it. There will be a trial in December. And the one about the residency will have a trial. Well, I don't think there's a trial set on that. They're gathering data. So those are now, both of them, both of those laws are subject to lawsuits initiated by the New Hampshire State Democrat Party, in one case the League of Women Voters, one case ACLU, basically to overturn them. There is on top, and by the way, these people aren't suing Massachusetts, which has the same laws. The other problem is there's a massive disinformation campaign underway, and this starts with, well, I've got the letter here from our U.S. Senator Jean Shaheen, and she sent a letter out in April basically complaining. She sent it to the Democrat presidential candidates, complaining about the fact that we are disenfranchising our voters, creating a poll tax on college students, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And helpfully enough, all of those people, and I'm not sure how many there are or were then, but it was probably like 15, they all said, yes, that's terrible, that Governor Sununu. Well, we went back and looked. Every one of them comes from a state with laws identical to the one that they're calling voter suppression in New Hampshire. This question of poll tax. Most of the voters, I'm sure, know that a poll tax, it was a construct of the recreation? No, not recreation.
Revolution?
No, the period after the Civil War, where they were Reconstruction. And that was the way many Southern groups, Southern legislatures, mostly Democrats, by the way, came up with ways to prevent black people from voting. You had to pay to vote, or you had to pay to take the literacy test, or whatever it was. Well, that's illegal. So they're calling that this institutes a poll tax because you have to be a resident, and the residents have to
pay
have to
license.
get a driver's license and pay for it, $50, right? Well, they never called it a poll tax when all the rest of us for years have been doing driver's license as a consequence of voting in New Hampshire. But the state Supreme Court basically dispatched that, and they said, no, that's ridiculous. You don't have to pay to vote. You have to pay to get a driver's license if you are a resident. Separate things. You have to be a resident. We're trying to say you have to be a resident to vote. And just like the rest of us, 60 days later, you're supposed to have a driver's license. You're also supposed to pay taxes, support the state. And they pretty much said, no, we don't see that the state has any obligation to have two classes of voters, one who wants to be a citizen in New Hampshire just to vote, but doesn't want to bother with the rest. The 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution basically provides for equal treatment under the law. Basically, everybody's supposed to be treated the same. This is not equality of outcomes, this is equality of treatment before the law. And people go back to things like Bush versus Gore. Remember the big deal about that? Went to the Supreme Court and they gave the election to Bush. No, actually, what the U.S. Supreme Court decided was, no, you cannot have a separate treatment of voters, looking at the votes, the hanging chads, for these three districts that are all Democratic. So basically what they stopped was the Al Gore plan to basically take the election. No, the reason I think the poll tax is interesting, State Senator Melanie Levesque, who, by the way, as I think represents some of our viewers here in Nashua. 3
boards and
yes, correct, I think. And she was the one saying this is a poll tax. And, she and Senator Shaheen, it's hard to understand their motives, but either they are ignorant of the actual facts or they understand them and they're trying to spread something they know to be not true. But this is a very big issue. As I say, when you get one political party trying to return to a system unique in this country that allows people from other states to come here, affect our elections, go home. You can show up at the polls, could show up in the polls, and next to you checking in is someone from the state of Washington. By the way, in 2016, the Long Distance Award went to 3 voters who registered from the state of Washington.
That's good.
So, Granite State taxpayers, www.granitestatetaxpayers.org. We've been arguing against this. We've written position papers. All the stuff's on our website. We go up, we testify. Anyone who's listening that wants to help out in this process, go to our website. You can sign up for our email list. And, we try to organize people to help influence the legislature for the betterment of New Hampshire taxpayers. So that's pretty much the state of this thing. We are arguing back against these various politicians. And like I said, 2,246 people from Massachusetts. Massachusetts is a state where nobody wakes up on election day and says, boy, they really need my vote.
So how's that going to be really, I don't know, what would you say, to keep these people out of our election? I mean, can they go in there, and now you said, and with a driver's license?
Well, what our focus here, Granite State taxpayers, is to change the laws that have allowed people to do these things, to come in, be a resident of another state. As I said, you don't get a driver's license unless you prove it. Where is your tax return filed from? Not New Hampshire. But our laws have allowed that. We think that's wrong for the reasons I articulated. 2 classes of citizens. I vote, I pay taxes. They vote, they don't pay taxes. And as an advocate for taxpayers, we think that the people voting for our representatives who make the laws, who make the taxes, it is important that we have only New Hampshire residents doing that, because only they have to live with it.
Now, do New Hampshire residents who don't drive and don't have a driver's license can get an identification card?
You can get an identification card at the DMV for voting purposes. You have to show you're a resident.
Because I know Florida did that, and
it's free.
So there's no poll. So the people that talk about a poll tax are really
well. There's no poll tax if you don't drive.
That's right.
It's no poll tax anyway.
Right.
But they're trying to call it one.
Right. But that's what I'm saying. They can.
Yeah. You can vote if you're a resident, and if you're not a driver, you don't have to have a driver's license.
You have to prove you're a resident and a citizen.
I won't get into the citizen stuff. That's pretty loose.
Okay.
But you're supposed to show that you are those things. To get a driver's license here, you have to show your citizenship.
Well, I know I've watched that, and I was wondering whether there's going to be some prosecution of some of the people if they find.
Well, there always are prosecutions. They don't get a lot of publicity. Well, it's very few, as I said, because most of it's only double voting that really is illegal under our legal system.
I see.
If these two laws that have been passed, signed by the governor, survived attempts to turn them over, if they don't get thrown out in court, then all of a sudden our laws will require you to be a resident.
And that's what everybody else who votes
like every other state. And
right.
You can go to the Secretary of State's office, they have a whole list.
Why should there be a different class of voters, especially when many of our voting for representatives or senators, some of those votes are so close they decided,
The coin toss.
Yeah.
Or 5 or 6 votes.
Right. There's at least a couple dozen recounts on any of those.
So that's best I can give you of this. So go to our website if you want to read more.
Right.
Thank you for having me, Carl.
Well, thank you very much for being here and giving our people the information that they need, because it's not very clear out there. And that's one of the reasons we have this show, is to help clarify these things.
There's an election coming.
Right.
And if we don't return to people who care about your real voting rights for residents, you're going to have more of this craziness.
Right. Well,
thank you, sir.
Thank you very much for your time.
My pleasure. Have a good day.
We'll have you back.
Look forward to it.